Today, Weekend on CKNW News Talk 980. Once again, here's Sean Leslie.
Any day with Zeppelin is a good day. All right, Marc Emery, the so-called Prince of Pot, he's serving out his sentence in the United States for selling pot seeds into the United States. But now the U.S. government says he can be transferred back to a Canadian prison to serve out the rest of his term. You will hear from his wife, Jodie Emery, a pot activist herself, right now joined by John Conroy. Mr. Conroy is a lawyer in the Fraser Valley who's handled many cases in federal court regarding prisoners. He's the author of Canadian Prison Law. Mr. Conroy, hi, how are you?
Not bad, thank you.
So how would this work now? Is it up to the federal government to say, okay, Marc Emery, you can come home?
Well, it's governed by something called the International Transfer of Offenders Act, which was amended by this government not that long ago, and so presumably he's under the amended version. But essentially, all parties need to consent, which means the U.S., Marc Emery, and Canada. And so the first step, he's obviously applied. That application to the U.S. government has here been approved. His application, he presumably has one into the Canadian government, which is processed by the International Transfer Unit of the Correctional Service of Canada. And once this U.S. approval is through, then it's up to Canada and the Minister of Public Safety, who was Vic Taves until last week, and we'll presumably know on Monday, I hear the shuffle is to take place then, who the new minister is. And so if Canada approves him, then Marc will have to decide whether to accept the transfer to go through with it or not. And he'll have a number of factors to weigh in making that decision. I'm not completely sure, and Jody will be able to enlighten us as to how much time he has left, remembering that in the U.S. system, if you're a foreigner, there are certain disadvantages, but you do get deported at around 85% of the sentence. And so if he serves out his U.S. sentence, he would be deported back to Canada, free and clear of any Canadian clutches by the Correctional Service of Canada or the Parole Board of Canada, and he would be free to carry on. He wouldn't be able to return to the U.S. without a waiver of inadmissibility, and his record would remain a U.S. record, accessible easily, but still not part of a Canadian criminal record. On the other hand, if he transfers or accepts the transfer and consents to the transfer, then he will ultimately end up at a jumping-off spot and probably bring him up the West Coast, and he will end up at Pacific Institution, the Regional Reception Center, where everybody who is sentenced to a federal sentence in B.C. goes in order to be classified and processed to determine whether you're maximum, medium, or minimum security and what institution you should be placed at. And in this whole process, Canada in particular will convert the U.S. sentence to a Canadian sentence and will establish various eligibility dates. And if Marc is passed, and I'm sure he is, this 1/3 date, which would be normally Canadian eligibility for parole,
right,
and that'll be 1/3 from the date of sentencing. He would then be, the paperwork will show that his eligibility dates are deemed to be the date of his transfer, so the date of arrival in Canada. And so he'll probably be past eligibility for day and full parole. But that doesn't mean you walk out. That means that you get to the reception center, they take 3 to 4 months to process you, do up all the paperwork on you, gather it from various places, and then ultimately submit your paperwork. Well, first of all, they'll classify you, and Marc should be classified at minimum security, particularly because of his offense, nature of his offense and his age, and then place him and then submit the paperwork to the Parole Board of Canada, and they usually require 3 or 4 months lead time. And then he'd have to have a hearing because the feds abolished accelerated parole, which would normally apply to first-time federal offenders like Marc who have no history of violence. And so he has to apply, he has to convince the board, try and get first the support of his case management team, the caseworkers in the institution, and then convince the board that he's not an undue risk to reoffend, and that the grant of full parole in his case would aid his reformation and rehabilitation. The alternative is he sits in Canada until 2/3 of what's left from the date of arrival, and that's the statutory release date for somebody who comes up on a transfer. And then he'd be entitled to his release, but still under supervision until warrant expiry. So when you take a parole, you're on parole, subject to suspension for a breach of a condition, in anticipation of a breach of a condition, or simply to protect society. So you're a puppet on a string until the end of your sentence. So critical to know how much time he has left and whether it's really worthwhile moving from probably a place where he knows everybody, is reasonably comfortable and knows the basics and knows that he'll be kicked out free and clear at 85%, or do you want to come back and subject yourself to the vagaries of the Correctional Service of Canada's assessment process and probably be into a whole brand new situation for at least 3 or 4 months before hopefully seeing the light of day, but being on parole until warrant expiry.
Have you handled similar cases like this? Are there cases where Canadians in U.S. prisons just say, you know what, it's better to stay here and do that and not have to worry about the Correctional Service of Canada?
That's the way it's become, because
Really?
the Harper government has successfully turned the clock backwards on our correctional system, and it's now, in my opinion, almost as bad as what it used to be back in the 60s and 70s. And so American prisons, on the other hand, some of them have turned around and have got much better. The courts down there have ordered decarceration due to overcrowding and things like that. And so it's not always that advantageous to come back to a Canadian prison. It used to be, and the whole purpose, one must remember, is that ultimately a Canadian citizen who has a right to enter Canada under the Constitution and a right to remain and a right to leave, the Canadian citizen will ultimately be deported back to Canada. So he or she is coming back. And so the question is, what is in the Canadian public interest? So this statute, the earlier versions of it, were introduced as a humanitarian, progressive thing that was in the Canadian public interest, so that the Canadian incarcerated abroad comes back, is assessed by Canadian correctional officials. They get to know him over a period of time and to assess his risk to the public, to program him, and then to release him subject to conditions that protect the Canadian public, and as I've explained, subject to the parole process. If you come back on a deportation, you come back free and clear. And so if there's any concern about the person being a risk, the deportation is obviously not in the Canadian public interest the way a transfer would be.
All right. Well, Jodie Emery has been on the line listening. Of course, Jodie is Marc's wife. She's a political activist, public speaker, owner of Cannabis Culture Headquarters. Jodie, you've heard what John Conroy has to say. Your comments on this, do you think Marc really does want to come home, or is it better to serve out the rest of his time in the U.S.?
Well, Marc's kind of aware of a lot of those details, and it's been good to hear more of it. But we do know that that's the situation, coming home next July 9th, being kicked out of the U.S. then for 85% of the 5-year sentence for good behavior. That does sound preferable in many ways. However, Marc does want to get transferred, and we thought if we could get him transferred quickly, if we could get the signature pretty soon and get him home, somehow a lot of political pressure could perhaps expedite his application and his return home. But it is true that he could come home under Canadian supervision and with all these conditions, and could make life very difficult for him. Otherwise, he could be kicked out of the U.S. and not have any records. So he's aware, and it's always a bit of a gamble to decide what way to go. But that's the same as deciding what kind of plea deal to take and all those details. So it's never been easy.
Yeah.
But if Marc's going to continue to advocate for cannabis law reform and perhaps engage in civil disobedience in doing that, he will have a major problem here in Canada. So he's probably better off to wait until he's deported so that they do not have that kind of control over.
So he's free and clear, as you were saying. John Conroy, one last question. I'll let you go. And as you said, we do have some political uncertainty at the top right now in Ottawa. Hopefully that's cleared up next week. But it is still within the power of the Harper government, correct, to just say, forget it, we don't want to approve this transfer?
Oh, that's right. And most of the decisions, first by Stockwell Day when he was Minister of Public Safety, then Peter Van Loan, and certainly Vic Taves, were negative decisions compared to what used to occur before they became the government.
John Conroy,
they tried to punish Canadian citizens under the guise of public safety, which doesn't make any sense at all, because if they're coming into the clutches of our own correctional system, then any risk to public safety would be after that. But that's the line that they have taken, and they have been overturned in the federal court quite often. But if Marc's only got a year to go to 85%, certainly my recommendation to him would be not to bother. He'd be better off to flatten it out and get deported back.
John Conroy, thank you for your time. I'll ask Jodie Emery to stand by. What do you think? Do you think the Canadian government should say yes to this transfer? 604-280-9898. Should Marc Emery come home? Star 9898 on your cell phone. We'll be back with Jodie Emery and your calls on CKNW News Talk 980.
So bring back Marc Emery, bring him back. He was only selling hot seats, not heroin or crack. So bring back Marc Emery, bring him back.
This is the World Today Weekend on CKNW News Talk 980. This is the World Today Weekend on CKNW News Talk 980. Once again, here's Sean Leslie.
All right, speaking with Jodie Emery. She's the president of Cannabis Culture and the owner of Cannabis Culture Headquarters, a political activist, public speaker. Her husband, Marc, is serving time in a U.S. prison for selling marijuana seeds. And just to clarify, Jodie, so if he did serve out the rest of his sentence in the U.S., and where is he, Mississippi?
Yep.
Yeah, he could be out by next summer, like 1 year from now, roughly?
July 9th is the early release date, July 9th next year.
Now, having heard what John Conroy has said, and I'm sure, as you mentioned, you've heard this kind of thing before, are you leaning against trying to get him back to Canada?
Well, it almost seems like the Conservatives would be punishing him by bringing him home, so I'm not sure which is the better option. So really, it's I've always wondered about that. Marc wonders too. And 2 years ago when he applied for transfer, of course, it would have been preferable to have happened then. But I don't know. Maybe if I ask the Conservatives enough to bring him home, they won't, and that'll work in our favor. I'm not quite sure exactly what's the best way to go.
Is it your sense that once Marc is out, whether it's in the United States next year or maybe if the transfer is approved and it's here in Canada and it's a bit earlier but with all sorts of conditions, is it still your sense that he plans to continue sort of waging his political battle around marijuana, Jodie?
Oh, absolutely. But he doesn't necessarily require civil disobedience, peaceful civil disobedience, which is what he did. Remember, in 1994, when he started selling seeds, nobody else was doing it. There weren't even medical marijuana laws anywhere in the United States, and now there's 18 and 16 decrim and 2 legalization. But Marc gave millions of seeds and millions of dollars to those activists because that was the way to make the money, by breaking the law and using that money for good. He doesn't need to do that anymore. There are hundreds and hundreds of seed sellers all throughout Canada, the U.S., and around the world. None of them are giving money to legalization efforts. They're cashing in. But Marc's purpose was just to do it at that time, and he was successful, and people planted the seeds of freedom to overgrow the government, as he said. So he's accomplished that. There's no need to sell seeds again because people have already got all the varieties and everything they need now.
But the law hasn't changed in Canada, has it? We seem to be stuck in time here in Canada.
Well, as soon as Marc was arrested for extradition and then the Conservatives got elected in 2006, right after that, that's when things started going downhill. So definitely Canada has been going backwards with Harper in charge, and the U.S. has been making progress. But remember that the war on drugs and marijuana prohibition began in the United States. It spread from the United States around the world like a cancer, going into Mexico and Canada and Bolivia and Colombia and all over the world, into Afghanistan. We know our own soldiers of the Canadian military are involved in the drug war abroad, and it's the United States that has always funded and pushed for this. So the drug war has to end in the United States first, and that was what Marc knew. and only by killing the cancer at its source can we kill it all over the rest of the world and start freeing people from prison and saving billions of tax dollars and eliminating the lifeblood of gangs, which is drug money. And it's the government that's making everything worse here in Canada, while in the United States, progress is happening to set the example for the rest of the world.
604-280-9898. Ron in Abbotsford's on the line. Hi, Ron.
Yeah, hello, Sean. I had no use for Marc Emery before, but I've changed my mind. I like to see consistency in the law, and I'd like Jodie to respond to on the news the other day. They mentioned a cop that was convicted of stealing narcotics from the exhibit room. He gets no jail term now and no criminal record. Now, what's worse, a breach of trust or abuse to the taxpayers? We're paying that guy's wages. We're not paying Mark's wages. So what's worse? I think selling seeds is very frivolous, and I'm angry about that part of it. And that's not just one cop. There's a lot of cops that do that. And here Mark's sitting in a bloody jail cell for selling seeds? That's ridiculous.
Well, Jodie, what do you say?
Absolutely, and one of the problems with prohibition is that it creates corruption. Police. The police get involved in the corruption because how can they resist when there's gangsters with guns and millions of dollars saying, just take this money and we'll let you go and live and take care of your kids and you let us sell our drugs and everything will be okay? How can cops not resist that? We know in Mexico and all throughout the U.S. and Canada, police are corrupted by prohibition, and the only reason is because of the huge sums of money involved, and the only reason there's big money involved is because when something's illegal, there's a risk involved with dealing with it, and the risk increases the reward. It's just simple logic, and what's happening is a lot of police officers cannot resist that allure. Just like young people, teenagers, they can't resist the allure of the big money. Our whole world is run on making big money, and when you provide a market with huge sums of money like the illegal drug market, you suck people into it. Even the guy who designed TELUS's amazing advertising campaign, he was smuggling pot across the border. It's hard to say no to that much money, but it's only because of the police and the politicians who enforce prohibition that huge amount of money is available to be made.
Let's all remember that the President of the United States is a former pothead. He hung out with a group of fellow teenagers in Hawaii. They called themselves the Chiba Gang. Obama was well known as a big fan of marijuana. I don't think Stephen Harper's ever touched this stuff, but our Premier of British Columbia admits she dabbled with pot when she was a teenager. It is everywhere. And Jodie Emery, I did want to ask you, we do have this Sensible BC campaign now that is trying to get a referendum going in British Columbia on decriminalizing pot possession. We all know it's a federal responsibility. Provincial government cannot legalize pot, but the aim of this campaign is to have a referendum asking the government to stop the police from enforcing marijuana laws. Do you support this? Or are you involved in it? What are your thoughts on this?
Oh, I definitely support it because, police are being forced to arrest harmless people who haven't hurt anyone because of the laws that exist. Now, in the U.S., we're seeing states legalize pot because they're allowed to do that with their state constitutions. They've got a different system. Here in Canada, the drug laws are federal, and only the health minister can actually remove marijuana from the drug definitions. So in BC, we have to choose a different route. We can't change the drug laws here, but we do have a say over what police are allowed to do. And we can tell the police with the Sensible Policing Act, which is Sensible BC, that they're not allowed to spend any time or money arresting people for simple possession. Because people who get pot possession criminal records, they lose their scholarships, they lose their ability to travel, they lose job opportunities.
Can't travel.
Their lives are destroyed because of the law, not the pot. The pot didn't destroy their lives. So Sensible BC is looking to protect the taxpayers' dollars, protect peaceful British Columbians, and allow police to focus on more important crimes instead of arresting thousands of people for simple possession. And it's the only way we can do it so far in British Columbia. But we may as well, since legal marijuana is available just an hour south of Vancouver.
Sure is. Let's get Bob in Vancouver on the line. Bob, hi, go ahead.
Yeah, Jodie?
Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, you talk about, all the huge money in the drug trade and whatnot, right? Why is it huge?
It's huge because when something is made illegal, the value goes up. So we all know of Al Capone and the gangs that made big money during alcohol prohibition. So when you take away the risk involved, the actual substance isn't valuable.
What's your point, Bob?
But what if people didn't smoke it? How valuable would it be?
Well, you're going to try to kill the demand? You don't think 50 years of the drug war is going to...
Individually. Can't people realize Emery, he spends his entire life doing something when he could be doing something very valuable. I think he's a bright guy. But isn't there other things in his life that he could have done besides try to legalize pot?
You got 30 seconds, Jody.
Marc made Sunday shopping legal in Ontario. Marc broke the Sunday shopping laws by opening his bookstore when it was illegal to do so. Did you know rap music, the record 2 Live Crew, was also illegal in Canada? And Marc brought it in from the U.S. and sold it and said, take me to court so I can challenge this law because it's ridiculous to make music illegal. He did the same thing with High Times magazines and books about censored topics. Marc has been fighting for freedom for Canadians in many different ways before he even discovered pot.
All right, Jody, I have to jump in and leave it there. I'm sorry to cut you off, but I'm right up against the clock. Appreciate it. We'll have you back, Jodie Emery. We'll take a break for the 4 o'clock news here on CKNW News Talk 980.
When it comes to drinking, it's like a dog without a bone in its head.
This is the World Today weekend on CKNW News Talk 980.